Chapter 1. Guess that I'm just not getting why we're even going, Sarah stated stubbornly, not bothering to look up from her cell phone. Michael Dyer wrapped his hands around his glass of water and silently regarded his daughter for a moment. She had said the same thing at least 3 times during their long drive from California, and each time he hadn't had much of an answer to give her. He found himself in the same situation now. "The guy is my father," he said, realizing just how lame of a reason that was. "Was," she corrected. "Whatever, was. The guy was my father. That doesn't mean that you have to be the one to take care of things. You said that you hadn't spoken to him in a really long time." Michael nodded. "Not since we moved out to the coast. You were only 6 months old at the time, so that's been, what, a little over 16 years. So why do you even care?" He opened his mouth to respond, but the waitress picked that moment to bring their food. He sat back slightly as she set a sandwich down in front of him. The waitress seemed extremely disinterested in the entire process, and after presenting Sarah with her waffles, the woman turned on her heel and went back into the kitchen. She did it without a word or even an acknowledgement of their existence. "I know it doesn't make a lot of sense to you," Michael said as he watched grease drip off the chicken peeking out from between the 2 pieces of bread that formed his sandwich. "Honestly, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me either. I just feel like I have an obligation to take care of his funeral arrangements. There isn't anyone else to do it." Sarah set down her cell phone with a shake of her head. "Well, if you decide someday to become a major asshole like he seems to have been, don't expect me to pick up the tab for your casket." He smiled slightly. "I'll keep that in mind." The chicken sandwich was hardly what could be classified as good, but it was still a better option than the fast food they had been living on the past few days. Michael quickly ate it and turned his attention to the window next to them as Sarah picked at her own food. The diner was located next to a particularly lonely stretch of highway in southern Ohio. The view through the window displayed the parking lot, the road, and a few scraggly trees. There wasn't very much more to see. The sky was beginning to fill with storm clouds. There was a quiet rumble of thunder in the distance, and knew that it wouldn't be long before the rain arrived. The sight of the thick gray clouds gave him a brief sense of nostalgia. It had been a long time since he had seen a sky like this. Sure, San Diego had its share of storms, but they were different somehow. The weather had more of an oppressive feel here, a sense that it was not just gathering, but actually surrounding you. They were only a couple of hours from their destination. Most of the trip had involved him paying close attention to his phone's GPS to make sure they were on the right track, but now they were on highways that he knew well. He wondered if this was supposed to feel like a homecoming. Whether or not it was supposed to, it definitely didn't. There were few things in life that he would have preferred to do less than to return to Lamplight Woods. To distract himself more than out of some need to, he mentally ran through what needed to be done. He had a meeting with the funeral home director the next day. He had already determined that there wouldn't be a funeral service. It wasn't due to his negative feelings towards his father. He could have got past those for a few hours. It was because he knew that his father detested funerals. The thought of having one for him anyway as a final act of spite had briefly appealed to Michael, but he couldn't justify the additional cost just to throw one last barb. After the preparations for the burial were made, he would need to figure out what to do with the family business. That was going to be the difficult part. He still wasn't sure how he was going to handle that particular issue. Dad?" Sarah asked, pulling him out of his thoughts. Michael turned back towards her and found a very different expression on her face. Normally she carried an air of confidence even when she wasn't truly feeling that way, but now she looked nervous, almost timid. "What's wrong?" he asked sharply. "Nothing's wrong," she quickly assured him with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm okay. I was just wondering if, well, since we're going to be in town anyway." She paused and gulped in a deep breath. He had never seen her act like this before. "I was just wondering," she continued quietly, "if we could visit Mom while we're here." Michael felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He hadn't been expecting that request. A flood of emotions, both old and new, flooded into him, but he forced them down. Yeah, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Yeah, of course we can. Okay, she said simply. Thanks. Sarah had never known her mother, not really anyway. She'd only been 3 months old when Evelyn had died. They hadn't talked about her much over the years, and when they had, the conversations had been short. He got the feeling that his daughter knew how painful it was for him to talk about her mother even after all these years, and she had purposely steered clear of the topic. He felt a pang of guilt. That was something that needed correcting. Evelyn had been an amazing woman, and her daughter deserved to know all about her. It wouldn't be an easy conversation to have, but any pain that it caused him was irrelevant. Sarah had the right to know everything there was to know about her mother. He looked back out the window. Maybe this trip would end up being a good thing after all. He could take Sarah around to all the places that he and Evelyn had frequented while they were growing up. A few random memories of them as children popped into his head, and he couldn't help but smile. The smile slipped from his lips. There would be time for a trip down memory lane after the business matters were sorted out. Until then, he needed to stay focused on the matter at hand. Chapter 2. The storm ended up holding off for longer than Michael had expected it to. They were less than an hour from town when the rain began to fall. It was a hard downpour, and he turned the wipers up as far as they would go before flipping on the headlights. Even with them on, he struggled to see more than a dozen feet in front of them. It was coming down so hard that each drop sounded like a rock being tossed onto the car. With some reluctance, he slowed the car down. He had hoped to get into town before it got dark, but that didn't seem like a realistic goal anymore. His teeth clacked together as the car tire bounced in and out of another pothole. The back roads they needed to take to reach Lamplight Woods were, to put it mildly, in rough shape. They had never been well maintained, but he didn't remember them being quite this bad. This road is shit, Sarah stated bluntly, vocalizing his own internal monologue. Language, he chided her absently, gripping the wheel tighter as they hit another hole. And yes, it's complete shit. Is it like this the entire rest of the way? Probably. This part of Ohio doesn't have the kind of money that the areas around major cities do. That means the local towns don't have the budget to keep the roads repaired. Wonderful. At least there isn't much traffic. In the last hour, they encountered less than half a dozen other cars, and all of those had been going in the opposite direction. He risked taking his eyes off the road for a split second to glance over at Sarah. He was used to this sense of isolation from having grown up in this part of the world, but her entire life had been spent living in the city. This was a new experience for her, and she seemed a bit uncomfortable with it. It was time for a distraction. It's kind of hard to make out through the rain, but do you see that farm over there? He asked, pointing out her window with one finger. Barely, Sarah replied, turning her head and straining to see. That's the old Mackenzie farm. When I was a kid, there was a boy named Franklin that lived there. He was a couple of years older than me. He was struck by lightning 3 times in a single month. She made a face. There's no way that's true. I swear that it is. 3 times in 1 month, and each time he walked away without a scratch on him. There were witnesses during each strike. How is that even possible? I have no idea. It doesn't seem like it should be, but it happened. That is extraordinarily weird. Yes, it is, he agreed. The thing is, there's a lot of weird stories like that around here. Everyone has seen something that they can't explain, or heard from a family member about something way outside the boundaries of normalcy. Especially in Lamplight Woods. Sarah turned towards him. What do you mean by that? Mean by what? The part about Lamplight Woods. Why does Lamplight Woods have more of these strange stories than other places? Michael hesitated before answering. Lamplight Woods is a small town in the middle of nowhere. It's isolated by thick woods on all sides. When you're there, It feels like it's disconnected from the rest of the world. Okay, but what's... I'm coming to it, he interrupted. When you're that alone, cut off from the rest of the world, it can weigh on you. You start to see things in the shadows. You begin to wonder if maybe you're not as alone as you thought you were, and if you're not, just what is it that's in there with you? She considered that for a moment before saying, "So Lamplight Woods is full of nut jobs. Gotcha." He couldn't help but laugh. Not the point that I was getting at, but you're not necessarily wrong either. The light was fading rapidly. With the roads being in as rough shape as they were, it became more and more difficult to follow the twists and turns. They fell silent as he concentrated on driving. He felt the forest before he saw it. He was aware that sensing the presence of a forest wasn't really a thing, but he couldn't deny that it happened. It was like a great invisible weight was pushing against him, an oppressive force radiating towards them from in front of the car. As they drew closer, he could see the first of the tall trees looming ahead even through the rain and darkness. They were black silhouettes against an even blacker background, barely visible, but definitely there. The road straightened out and led directly through them. He saw Sarah shifting in her seat uncomfortably from the corner of his eye. He understood her discomfort, and he even shared it. He sighed. He really wished they had managed to get there before they had run out of daylight. "Welcome to Lamplight Woods," he muttered under his breath. Chapter 3. The rain abruptly stopped as they drove down the narrow road leading through the forest. The moon remained behind the clouds, and it was still very dark in the shadows of the trees, but at least Michael was able to see more than a few feet in front of the car. He began to relax a bit. Now that there was more visibility, the path felt more familiar and less threatening. He had gone down this road in the back of a bus every school day when he was a child. Lamplight Woods was a very small town with a population just over 3,000 at its peak, and because of that limited population, the school-age children were either homeschooled or shipped to the next town over to attend classes. His father hadn't been interested in having him around all day, and he had felt the same about that particular option, so each morning at 6 he had trudged out to the designated bus stop at the edge of town. A sudden urge struck him, and he reached over to put down the driver's side window. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, folding her arms over her chest. "It's freezing out there." It was, in fact, not freezing outside. It was the middle of June, and even after all the rain, the air temperature was still in the upper 70s. Much like her mother had been, however, Sarah was almost always cold. He had joked on more than one occasion that she would politely ask for the thermostat to be turned up just a smidge while being dipped into a volcano. Michael took a deep breath and sighed in satisfaction. He had always loved the smell of pine trees and ozone after a downpour. The air smelled so clean and welcoming. As he inhaled the fresh air deep into his lungs, he reminded himself that living in Lamplight Woods had its ups and not just its downs. "Seriously," Sarah said impatiently, "what are you doing?" "Come on," Michael replied with a wave of his hand. "You can't tell me that smell isn't amazing." "What smell?" "Open your window and take a deep breath." "This is dumb." "Come on, humor your old man just this once." "I humor you all the time. It's like a hobby at this point." Despite her protests, Sarah did as she had been instructed. At first she recoiled from the wind, but she gathered herself and inhaled. Her eyes opened wide. "Oh, okay," she said. "I get it now." "I know, right?" The road continued on straight through the forest for a few miles. There were no side streets or turnoffs, just the path leading forward. Seemingly forgetting about her earlier protest regarding putting the windows down, Sarah leaned up against the passenger door to keep the wind on her face. They passed a green sign on a metal pole, and Michael began to slow the car down. They were almost in town, but there was something coming up before that. A minute later it came into view, and he pulled over and brought the car to a stop. "Come on," he said, taking off his seatbelt and opening the car door. What's going on? Sarah asked as she followed his example. Is something wrong? No, everything's fine. I want to show you something. Grab the flashlight out of the glove box. When they were both out of the car, Michael took the flashlight from her and turned it on. The thin pale beam didn't illuminate much. It'd be enough for what he needed, however. He led the way forward. Directly ahead of them was a small wooden bridge that spanned over a shallow creek. He stepped onto it and ran his hand over the guardrail. Lamplight Woods only had this one road leading in and out, and he'd crossed this particular bridge thousands of times. In a strange way, it was like being reunited with an old friend. This is Oak River Bridge, he said, removing his hand from the guardrail. It's not much of a river, Sarah commented as she looked over the side at the water below. It used to be bigger. When I was a kid, it was about twice the width and depth that it is now. The county built a reservoir that siphoned off a lot of the flow when the population of some of the neighboring towns started growing. He continued on the bridge until he reached the center. He knelt down and brushed away some of the dirt and grime from one of the posts. It only took a few seconds of searching with the flashlight to find what he was looking for. This is what I wanted to show you, he said, motioning for Sarah to join him. His daughter silently crossed over to him and knelt down beside him. He watched her face as she stared at the spot on the post that he indicated with his index finger. At first there was only an expression of confusion, but he smiled slightly as it changed into comprehension. ES and MD, she read from the carvings on the post. You're in Mom's initials. Yep, Evelyn Stone and Michael Dyer. Her mother carved them here when we were 9. At the time I thought she was crazy and that we were going to get in trouble. Now I think she knew even though we were just kids. Sarah turned towards him. Knew what? That we were meant to be together. He stood up and swiped away the sun and moisture from his eyes. We should get going. The rain might start up again soon. The road widened slightly after they crossed the bridge, and the trees gave way to open grass. They drove less than 10 minutes before lights could be seen in the distance. They were coming up to the town itself. There was a building on the left side of the road that Michael didn't recognize. As they drew closer, he saw that it was some sort of clinic or small hospital. He looked at it curiously as they passed by. The structure hadn't been there when they had left Lamplight Woods. He soon found that it wasn't the only new addition to the town. When they had previously lived there, Lamplight Woods' downtown area had barely qualified as one. It had consisted of a dozen local businesses and the town hall, which had also been used as the offices for the mayor and sheriff. All of it had been contained on a single street. Now, though, it was more than triple the previous size. Most of the businesses were closed for the night, but a few still had light spilling out of their windows. One of those was the Split Log, a bar that had been there longer than he had been alive. It was good to see that some things hadn't changed. From how you described it, I was expecting this place to be smaller, Sarah remarked. Yeah, well, so was I, Michael admitted as he looked out the window. There's a lot more here than there used to be. What's that over there? He looked in the direction that she was pointing. Oh, that's Oak River Falls, he told her. You know that creek we just passed over? It wraps all the way around town. A small part of it passes by the town hall and goes down 3 levels of rock, which creates a tiered waterfall. It's quite a bit deeper than back at the bridge. He pulled the car into a nearby parking lot and they got out once again. He led the way to the edge of the river, being careful not to slip in the grass. The falls were lit up by a series of flood lamps attached to the nearby buildings. The water rushed off the top shelf of rock and flowed down 2 more drops before splashing into the river below. It wasn't more than 14 feet tall, but it was still an impressive sight. Can I help you folks? A voice asked from behind them. Chapter 4. Michael turned around to find a woman standing at the edge of the parking lot. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but he could see that she was wearing a suit and that a pair of glasses were perched precariously on her nose. Her arms were crossed over her chest. We're fine, he said, holding up a hand to shield his eyes from the lights. I'm just showing my daughter the falls. They're much easier to see during the day, the woman replied coldly. The tone of her voice made it very clear what she was actually saying. You're right, he said slowly. We'll come back tomorrow. That's a good idea. Michael motioned for Sarah to follow him as he led the way back to the car. The woman didn't move as they did so. She just stood there with her arms crossed and watched silently. It wasn't until he opened the car door that she spoke again. We don't get many tourists in Lamplight Woods, she commented. We're not tourists, he replied. We used to live here. The woman seemed a bit less certain of herself. You did you? Yes, my name is Michael Dyer, and this is... Michael Dyer? She said, cutting him off. Gerald Dyer's son? Yes, that would be me. The woman walked over to him and offered her hand. Thoroughly confused by the entire situation, he accepted it and shook it. Now that she was closer, he found that she was older than he was, probably in her late 50s, with dark hair and high cheekbones. He was sure that he had seen her before, but he couldn't place where. I was sorry to hear about your father's passing, the woman told him. My condolences. Thank you, Michael mumbled. I'm Carol Dilfer, Lamplight Woods mayor. I was working late tonight and saw you two pull into the parking lot from my office window. Some of the local drunks occasionally, relieve themselves on the falls. I assumed that was what was happening now. No, ma'am, Sarah said from inside the car. No pissing in the river for us. Delightful child. She smoothed the front of her suit jacket. I still have some work to finish, so I'll leave you to be on your way. Before we go, would you mind answering a question for me? Michael asked. Lamplight Woods has really grown since we moved. What happened? The mayor's attitude visibly brightened. Isn't it wonderful? About, 9 years ago or so, a privately owned company called Synthetic Material Research, or SMR for short, came to town. They research and develop new plastics and polymers. I'm proud to say that I had a hand in bringing SMR here, and that I've also been spearheading the town's economic and physical growth. I see. Thank you, Mayor Dilfer. Have a good evening. The mayor turned on her heel and walked back inside the town hall. Michael watched the door for a moment before getting into the car. Sarah made an unpleasant sound as she put on her seatbelt. She was friendly, Sarah observed sarcastically. You weren't exactly a ray of sunshine yourself, Michael pointed out as he guided the car back onto the street. We're here for all of 5 minutes and you're already annoying government officials. What can I say? I have a way with people. They left the downtown area and continued on until they reached a four-way stop. Michael took the street to the right and followed it for less than a mile before making yet another right at the next stop. He drove for a few minutes longer before pulling the car into the gravel driveway. We're here, he announced. The driveway belonged to a large two-story house. The roof was sloped harshly, and between that and the ancient wooden shutters that gave the entire structure an unwelcoming facade. A long porch wrapped around the front and side of the building. The driveway continued past the house into a small detached garage. There were no neighbors, just an unkempt yard and the woods beyond. Michael told Sarah to wait in the car as he got out. He walked out into the center of the front yard and looked up at the house. He had been thinking about this moment since they had left California. There were a lot of memories tied up in this house, and he hadn't known how he would react to seeing it again after all this time. What he hadn't even considered was that he might not feel anything at all as he stood in front of it. It was just an old house, nothing more. He ran a hand over his face. Any power that it had once had over him had died with his father. He turned his head towards the large wooden sign to the left of the sidewalk leading up to the front door. The house hadn't just been his home. It had also been the family business. His grandfather had opened Forgotten Tales and later passed it down to his father. Now he owned it, and he had no idea what he was going to do with it. Are we going inside or what? Sarah called from the car, pulling him out of his thoughts. I am, he called back. You're going to wait in the car for a few more minutes until I tell you it's okay to come in. Why? Because I said so. He smiled at her before realizing that she probably couldn't see his face in the dim light. Also because your grandfather was completely paranoid, and I want to make sure that there aren't any surprises waiting inside. He went up the 3 creaky steps to the porch and fished a set of keys out of his pocket. It had been a long time since he had tossed out the old bent key he had used when he still lived there. Another key had arrived from his father's attorney a few days before they had left San Diego. He unlocked the door and went inside. The store was pitch black, and he reached for the light switch. He grunted in amusement as the thought crossed his mind that, if this had been a horror movie, the switch wouldn't have worked. Lights came right on, though, and he squinted against the sudden glow until his eyes adjusted. Once he could see again, he looked around the store for the first time in over a decade and a half. Chapter 5. Forgotten Tales looked almost exactly like Michael remembered it. Every nook and cranny was packed with tables and shelves containing a wide variety of items. Furniture, toys, paintings, collectibles, silverware, decorations, stuffed animals, even an old tuba. If something could possibly be shoved into the store, it probably had been. Some of the items in Forgotten Tales were extremely valuable. Some of them were completely worthless. All of them were for sale for the right price. He closed the door behind him and turned his head to the right. His favorite part of the shop had always been the large wall of clocks, and he was pleased to see that it was still right where it had been. Dozens of the intricate devices, large and small and everything in between, hung from the wall. A number of others were displayed on shelves, and the entire section was flanked by 2 large grandfather clocks. All of them were in working order, and for a moment he simply stood there listening to the ticking and whirring of gears. Turning his attention back to the matter at hand, he made his way through the various tables and display cases until he reached the cash register. It sat on top of a glass case that showcased some of the rarer and more expensive items in the store. He opened the cash register and peered inside. The drawer opened as the register emitted a loud ding. There was no money, and he would have been surprised to find any there. His father had made sure to empty it each night into the large safe that he kept in his office. He wasn't looking for money, however. He gripped the drawer with both hands and lifted it up until it popped off the hinges. Setting it down on top of the display case, he reached into the hole the drawer had occupied and felt around until his fingers touched a small metal object covered in tape. He tore the object free and pulled it out. It was a key. Unlike the plain one that he had used to unlock the front door, this one was much older and more ornate. The brass felt cool in his hand. "What does that go to?" Sarah asked from the doorway. Michael jumped in surprise and smacked his knee against a nearby stool. He swore loudly and gritted his teeth in pain. "You're supposed to be waiting in the car," he forced out slowly. "I know, but it's kind of creepy out there. Did you notice how quiet it is outside?" "We're way out in the country," he pointed out. "Yeah, but I mean it's really quiet. No insect sounds, no birds, no nothing. Just silence." He rubbed his knee as he watched his daughter walk around the shop. She seemed fascinated by the countless items all around her, and she stopped frequently to examine an object before moving on to the next. He had to admit that Forgotten Tales looked rather impressive to someone that had never seen it before. Since he had grown up in it, he had never had the chance to view it in the same way that a first-time guest would. "So, what does the key go to?" Sarah asked again. Michael set the key down on the counter and tapped it with one finger. He didn't answer her as he continued to watch her. He wasn't trying to be mysterious, but he wasn't exactly sure how to answer her question. "Do you remember the conversation we had earlier this evening?" he asked finally. "You're going to have to be more specific," she replied as she crossed over to the counter. "I told you that Lamplight Woods has more than its fair share of strange stories." "Oh, yeah, right. I remember. Our family, how do I put this? Lamplight Woods' stories are our family stories. I'm not following you. It's easier to show you than to try to explain it. He pushed the key across the counter to her. Go ahead. Take it. Sarah looked at him curiously for a moment before she picked up the key. He led her over to a large bookcase and shoved aside a few paperbacks on the third shelf. At the very back was a keyhole. At his prompting, she inserted the brass key into the hole and turned it. There was an audible click as the lock disengaged. The right side of the bookcase moved forward slightly. He gripped the edge and swung it open on its hidden hinges, revealing another room behind it. Your great-grandfather Charles was a big fan of mystery stories, Michael said. One of the biggest tropes in those kinds of books is the hidden passage behind the bookcase. When he built his private office, he made sure to include one. The room beyond the doorway was large, even larger than the store was. The walls were lined with bookcases packed with old hardcover books, and a patterned rug covered the floor. A desk and a heavy leather chair stood at the far side of the room. Display cases with handwritten tags and strange-looking objects were set up at even intervals throughout the chamber. Michael watched Sarah intently as she took in the study. Her eyes were wide, and the expression on her face was one of disbelief. He smiled slightly as her brow furrowed. She caught on to the oddest thing about the room quicker than he had thought that she would. Wait, she said in confusion. How is this? She glanced back out into the shop, and her look of disbelief increased. She turned and went back to the front door before disappearing outside. A few minutes later she returned, and her furrowed brow had turned into a full scowl. She tentatively put one hand through the doorway behind the bookcase. Once she was seemingly satisfied that it was real, she stepped through and went into the study. She quickly walked the length of it until she reached the desk. This isn't possible, she said, more to herself than to him. How is this possible? She looked at him accusingly. He raised his hands and shook his head. Hey, I'm not the one that made it this way, he said defensively. You can thank your great-grandfather for that. But it doesn't make sense. This room can't be here. When you look at the house from the outside, there's nothing past the main room. You think that's crazy? Take a better look at the lamps. The study was illuminated by a series of old lamps hanging from metal sconces that were attached to the dark wooden walls. They gave off a warm and friendly orange glow that made the entire room more pleasant and inviting. Sarah walked over to one of the lamps and tilted her head up to examine it closely. There are candles inside, she murmured. But then... Who lit the candles? Michael finished for her. If you look even closer, you'll see that the candles aren't melting. The flames aren't burning them down. He closed the bookcase behind them and went over to her. He gently put his arm around her shoulder and led her around the desk. She sat down in the chair and looked up at him in total confusion. Sarah, it's time that you learned a few things about our family, he told her. Chapter 6. Before Michael could continue, there was an odd sound from behind him. He turned just in time to catch a brief glimpse of something moving, but in the millisecond that it took his eyes to focus, it was gone. There was another movement, this time at the base of a display case, but once again he was unable to track the source. Dad, Sarah said uneasily. It's okay, he reassured her. Just stay in your chair and don't make any sudden movements. He slowly sat down on the floor and crossed his legs. He winced slightly as he did so, a jolt of pain going through the knee that he had bumped a few minutes earlier. Ignoring it, he held out his hand palm up. You don't have to be scared, Mira, he said to the seemingly empty room. I know it's been a long time, but you know me. It's me, Michael. There was an odd sound, a kind of crackling noise like static, and the scent of ozone momentarily filled his nose. Out of nowhere, a blue rabbit-like creature appeared on the floor in front of him. He heard Sarah gasp as the creature nervously looked over at her before disappearing and reappearing a few feet further away. He smiled at it. It's really me, Mira, he assured it. Go ahead. It's okay. The animal hesitated before moving forward to sniff at his fingers. Its blue fur had a soft glow to it that had always reminded him of a neon sign. Its long bushy tail, more like a raccoon's than a rabbit's, slowly moved back and forth behind it, tilted its head slightly, being careful not to touch the tiny but also very sharp horn that extended from its forehead to his hand. It closed its eyes and rubbed its face against his hand. His smile widened as he gently pet it, feeling the sensation of a faint electrical current running through his skin. It made a sound that was a combination of a purr and a growl. "It's good to see you again, too," he said. Mira opened its eyes and turned its head upward before disappearing again. It reappeared on the edge of the desk. Sarah stared at it without saying a word, and it regarded her the same way. Michael stood up with a grunt. "Mira, this is my daughter," he said calmly. "Sarah, put your hand out so that it can get your scent." After a brief hesitation, she slowly moved her hand towards the animal. It reached its neck out and began to sniff at the tips of her fingers, its nose moving rapidly. "What?" Sarah swallowed hard. "What is it?" "This is Mira," Michael said. "Mira's the only known Mirage in the world." "That doesn't really tell me anything." "It's a legendary creature that used to be native to a small island in the Indian Ocean. It's said that one of them was presented to Alexander the Great after he slew a mighty dragon. There isn't much known about them. No one even knows if Mira here is male or female." Mira had seemed to accept that Sarah was friendly, and it started to rub its face on her hand. She looked up at Michael, and when he nodded encouragingly, she started to stroke its fur gently. It suddenly vanished, only to appear less than a second later in her lap. It snuggled in, and she continued to pet it. "How does it do that?" she asked quietly. "What, the disappearing act?" "No clue. Teleportation seems to be an unconscious defense mechanism as well as a method of transportation. That's all that I know about it. Came as quite a surprise the first time that it happened. None of the lore says anything about teleporting." "It doesn't bite, does it?" "Nah, Mira is incredibly friendly. Will sometimes pop in on you when you're not expecting it, but otherwise, it's harmless." Sarah took a deep breath. "I think that I'd very much like to know just what the hell is going on." "Yeah, I would think so. Give me a second to collect my thoughts, okay?" Michael slowly walked around the room as both Sarah and Mira watched him. He had known this conversation was coming the entire trip, but he hadn't been able to figure out how he wanted it to go. It was long and complicated, and he didn't have all the information himself. Most likely no one person did. "You've heard of the Bermuda Triangle, right?" he asked. "Yeah," Sarah answered. "It's that place in the ocean where a bunch of ships and planes have gone missing." "Right. There are some places in the world that are just like that. Places where weird or mysterious things happen, and there's just no explanation for them. Lamplight Woods is one of those places." He shook his head slightly as he mentally corrected himself. "No, wait, that's not quite right. Lamplight Woods isn't like the Bermuda Triangle or Stonehenge or anywhere else in the world. It's much more than those places." "I'm sorry, I know that I'm not making much sense here." "No," Sarah agreed. "You really aren't. Lamplight Woods is it's like a lightning rod. Instead of drawing in electricity, though, it draws in the strange and the weird and the impossible. Things happen here on a daily basis that don't happen anywhere else. It's a place where science and magic and everything in between connect together. It's a place where the paranormal is, well, normal." "Dad, this has sounded crazy." "Crazier than you petting the mythological teleporting blue electric animal in your lap?" She pursed her lips. "Yeah, okay, fair point. There's a lot that I can't just explain to you. There are things you have to experience for yourself to really understand them. I never could have told you about Mira in a way that would have convinced you that I didn't need to be locked up in an asylum. You had to see it to believe it." "Yeah." She looked down at the animal happily lounging against her. "Okay, so Lamplight Woods is a strange place. I get that. What does that have to do with our family? Michael nodded once. Right, our family. First thing that you need to know about the Dyers is that our family had nothing to do with making Lamplight Woods the way that it is. It was like this way before we got here, and it'll probably be like this long after we're all gone. Well, good to know that we didn't break reality or whatever. He started to pace. The Dyers were some of the earliest settlers in this part of Ohio. Our ancestors were with the first group that called Lamplight Woods home. By all accounts, there weren't many problems for a long time. There were certainly reports of strange occurrences, but nothing too severe. It wasn't until my grandfather, your great-grandfather, was in his 20s that something terrible happened. What? I don't know the specifics. He didn't like to talk about what happened, and my dad didn't like to talk to me about much at all. What I do know is that there was a series of killings, that the townspeople managed to track down the killer. Michael walked over to one of the display cases. Blowing off a bit of dust, he carefully opened the glass door and withdrew a small silver orb about the size of an apple. The silver formed a web-like design around a dark red core. This is a psycho-ranger, he said, holding it out so that Sarah could see it without needing to get any closer. When a person directs all of their anger and hate into it, they can use it to transfer those feelings into another person. The killer was using this to drive people temporarily insane. He turned them into killers like himself. That's the thing about Lamplight Woods. It doesn't discriminate. It brings in everything strange regardless of whether it's good like Mira or evil like this godforsaken thing. He sighed as he put the sphere back into the case. After the Psycho Ranger was discovered and they figured out what it did, the townspeople that had uncovered it knew it was too dangerous to leave lying around. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't figure out a way to destroy it, so the only thing that they could think to do was to lock it away where it couldn't hurt anyone ever again. That's where Charles Dyer came in. He worked for years to figure out a way to create this room to contain it. Where better than a place outside of space and reality to hide a dangerous object? How did he do it? Sarah asked. I don't know. Grandpa Charles was an amazing man, and his brain just worked in a completely different way from everyone else's. Over time, he brought in more and more of the oddities that surfaced around Lamplight Woods. He was constantly investigating strange phenomena and increasing his bizarre collection. The town came to rely on him as the person to call when something weird happened. It was a responsibility that he took very seriously. When he passed away, that responsibility fell to my father. And now your father's dead. Now my father's dead, Michael repeated. Which brings us to the problem that I've been mulling over all week. What happens now? Chapter 7. The burial preparations took less time to make than Michael had thought. There wasn't much that needed to be taken care of since there wasn't going to be a funeral or graveside service, so all he needed to do was sign a few papers and pay for the coffin and plot. As he was leaving the funeral home, he stopped to take one last look at the casket he had selected. It was simple, little more than a wooden box with handles on the sides. It really wasn't much to look at, but part of him believed it was still more than his father deserved. He shook his head in a fruitless attempt to clear those types of thoughts out of his mind. Because of Lamplight Woods' small population, there weren't enough deaths per year to support a full-time funeral home. Instead, the local doctor ran it out of a room in his office space. He wasn't sure why, but that struck him as both morbid and amusing. It was like a silent statement about the quality of Lamplight Woods' medical care. Even though it was barely 10 in the morning, the heat was already radiating off the sidewalk as he walked through downtown. He had forgotten just how bad the humidity in Ohio could get. He felt like he was walking through an invisible swamp. Sarah had gotten some to drink from a small grocery store while she waited, and she was standing next to the car sipping from it when he arrived. "How did it go?" she asked. "Fine," he answered as he dug his keys out of a pocket in his khaki shorts. "Better than I expected. Are you ready to go see your mother?" She nodded shortly, and they both got into the car. Glanced over at her as he was starting the engine. She was obviously trying to appear calm and collected, but she wasn't being very successful at it. She had accepted everything that she had learned the previous night remarkably well. He had expected her to be more skeptical or maybe even resistant, but having seen actual evidence of his claims had made it easier on her. She had even let Mira sleep in bed with her. Now that they were going to visit her mother's grave, however, she was much less collected. He turned her attention away from her as he pulled out of the parking space. He knew how she felt. This would be the first time that he was going to see Evelyn since the day she had been buried, and even though there wasn't a logical reason for it, he was feeling extremely nervous. It was a short drive to the cemetery. Located just a couple of minutes north of the downtown area, Lamplight Woods' cemetery was home to generations of the town's residents. Some of the wealthier townsfolk had large family tombs, but the majority of the graves consisted of simple stone markers. He drove slowly over the rough gravel path that ran between the various sections of the cemetery until he reached the far side of the lot. There were very few graves in this section, and it was shaded by a group of tall trees. He brought the car to a stop and took the keys out of the ignition. "We're here," he announced unnecessarily, not sure what else to say. "Can we just wait here for a minute?" Sarah asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, of course. Take all the time that you need." He rolled down the windows so that they didn't roast in the summer heat and sat back in his seat. He thought about reaching over and taking her hand, but he quickly rejected the idea. She seemed to want to deal with her feelings herself. If she wanted his help or comfort, she would ask for it. He looked out the window. He couldn't see it from where they were parked, but underneath one of the oak trees was Evelyn's grave. He closed his eyes. The day he had lost her had been the worst day of his life, and he hadn't had any idea how he could possibly go on without her. He hadn't had a choice, though. He opened his eyes. There had been Sarah to take care of, and his own pain was irrelevant when measured against that responsibility. It had been hard, but they had managed. "I'm ready now," Sarah said as she unbuckled her seatbelt. They crossed the freshly mowed grass to the stone marker. When Michael had chosen where to have Evelyn buried, he had selected a spot that wasn't directly next to other graves. He was pleased to see that was still the case. She rested in a private area underneath a pleasant-looking tree. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it had been the best that he could manage at the time. He took a deep breath and looked down at the marker. Evelyn Marie Stone. What's with the inscription?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "The guiding flame in the dark," he said from memory, not bothering to read it. "It was a running joke between us. Well, not so much a joke as, I don't know, something between us." He was having a hard time thinking straight through the sudden sadness and weariness that had overtaken him. "Your mother had the most striking red hair that I've ever seen," he continued after a short pause to collect himself. "It was even redder than yours. She used to joke that she could use it as a signal fire if she was ever lost. A guiding flame in the dark. She was also—" He trailed off and stared off into the distance. He was so lost in his thoughts that he jumped in surprise when he felt a hand slide into his. Sarah smiled up at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. He smiled back and wiped at his own eyes before kissing her on the top of the head. "She loved you, you know. Holy crap, did she love you. More than anything." "More than she loved you?" Sarah teased him. "Oh yeah, and it wasn't even close. I'm half convinced that she only kept me around because finding someone else was just too much work." They laughed together, and as they did so, their spirits brightened. Michael looked back at the grave marker. This time he didn't feel the same wave of emotion as he had moments earlier. Things had changed. "I'm getting a little hungry," he confessed. "Are you hungry?" "I could eat," Sarah said with a shrug. "Let's go get some food. There has to be some place that offers takeout in all these new businesses downtown. We've got a long day of inventory ahead of us of forgotten tales. That sounds, fascinating. Yeah, I know it's boring, but I have to sort out the merchandise that can be sold to the public from the merchandise that will try to eat your face off. Very funny. She paused. Wait, you are joking, right? Did you see that carved bust of the bald man with the eye patch? It's haunted by the spirit of a pirate who... He cut himself off. They had been walking back towards the car, and they had been so distracted that they hadn't seen that a second vehicle had pulled up behind theirs. The woman stepping out of it was the same woman that they had encountered the previous night. Mr. Dyer, Mayor Carol Dilfer greeted him in a tone that somehow managed to be both pleasant and unpleasant at the same time. I was wondering if I could have a word with you. Chapter 8. Michael regarded the mayor silently for a moment. She was once again wearing a business suit, although this one was gray and had a skirt instead of pants. The sun was reflecting off of her glasses. You want to have a word here, he eventually said. It's a private conversation, Dilfer replied. No one else is here. It seems like the perfect place. An immediate retort came to mind, but he forced it down and instead said, Fine, what is it that you want? She shot Sarah a look. This conversation isn't appropriate for children. Sarah, I'll be right back. Dilfer pointed over to a nearby hill. That bench should work nicely. They walked over to the bench that she had indicated and sat down. Dilfer took off her glasses and tucked them into a pocket inside of her suit jacket. She folded her hands in her lap and nodded to herself. I've been looking into you, Mr. Dyer, Dilfer said. That's a pretty creepy way to start a conversation, Michael observed. She ignored him and continued on. You're a forensic consultant in San Diego. What is that exactly? Apparently looking into him didn't involve a quick Google search, but he kept that to himself. I offer consulting services for various people and organizations, mostly police departments and law offices. I specialize in reconstructing, examining, and evaluating crime scenes. And you're good at that? He raised an eyebrow. Very. She tapped the nail of her index finger against her thin lips. There's a matter that Lamplight Woods' sheriff is working on that I would like you to assist with. He immediately shook his head. I'm sorry, but I can't do that. I'm only in town long enough to bury my father and to get things squared away with forgotten tales. I don't think that you're quite understanding what I'm telling you. This particular case is something that the Dyer family has traditionally taken part in. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but he closed it again as he considered her words. He watched her carefully while he mulled them over. For her part, she simply stared back at him expressionlessly. With one sentence she had piqued his interest, and she obviously knew it. How bad is it? He asked. It's never good when there are children involved, Dilfer said. Fatalities? She hesitated ever so slightly. Multiple. Shit. Dilfer stood up and reached into her jacket. She produced a business card and handed it to him. He took it after a brief hesitation. That's Sheriff Grant's office and cell number, she said. Get in touch with her and she'll get you up to speed. Michael shook his head. Like I said, I'm not here to get involved with town issues. I'm just here to close out the family business. Dilfer smiled at him, a smile devoid of any warmth. Mr. Dyer, I pride myself on being able to read people. When I come to a decision about someone, I'm very rarely incorrect. You'll help. He bristled. You may think that you know me from a quick background check, but you don't. She pointed in the general direction of the grave he had visited. I don't have to know you that well. I knew your dearly departed Evelyn. It was years ago, back when I was the store manager at Whitman's Pharmacy. She had a summer job there. Michael looked closer at her. He had thought that she looked familiar when they had first met, but he hadn't been able to remember where he knew her from. She was a good person, Dover said. She wouldn't have been with you as long as she was if you were the kind of person to refuse to help when children are dying. Have a good day, Mr. Dyer. Michael watched her walk back to her car and drive away. It took him a few moments to realize that he was grinding his teeth. The woman's haughty nature and arrogant demeanor was extremely annoying. He looked down at the business card she had given him. The worst part was that, in this particular case, she happened to be right. He turned his head towards Evelyn's grave. A bit of a breeze had picked up, and it made the leaves and branches of the overhanging tree dance. What have you gotten me into this time, Evie? He asked, making a face. The wind rustling through the tree almost sounded like laughter. Chapter 9. Michael tried calling both the numbers on the card that he had been provided, but both times his call went directly to voicemail. He left a message detailing who he was and why he was calling, making sure to place an emphasis on the fact that the mayor had requested it. He had a lot of experience working with law enforcement officers, and that experience had taught him that many of them weren't too thrilled when an outsider was brought into an active investigation. He had plenty to do while waiting for a return call. He and Sarah spent the afternoon going through Forgotten Tales' showroom floor to take inventory. Michael logged each item in a notebook as they went, being careful to note the type of item, its location in the store, and if it really was what it seemed to be. He wasn't surprised to find a number of items in the shop that shouldn't have been for sale. While both he and his father learned how to identify cursed, possessed, and otherwise special objects, his father had never been good at it. Michael, however, was much more observant, and he had picked up the skill at a very young age. "How about this one?" Sarah asked, holding up a candlestick. "Just a candlestick," he informed her, making a record of it in the notebook. "It's made of silver, and it's extremely rare for objects made of silver to be influenced." "Sorry, for it to be what?" "Influenced." He waved his pencil in the air. "It's a generic term your great-grandfather used for things that have been unnaturally changed by outside forces. Sort of a catch-all name for haunted objects, possessed people, magic items, and so forth." "Gotcha." She paused. "Is magic really an actual thing?" He nodded. "Yeah, but it's extremely rare these days. It was a lot more common before the Industrial Revolution." She sighed. "I'm not sure that I'm ever going to get used to all of this. What about this music box?" "That was owned by Maria Nikolaevna, the daughter of Tsar Nicholas II. She and her family were murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918. If you play the music box on nights with a half moon, you'll hear the family screaming in horror between the notes." She blinked. So this is not supposed to be out here?" "Nope." He took the music box from her and went into the hidden study behind the bookcase. He found a spot on one of the shelves and gently placed the object in the gap. Most of the items that he had removed from the shop were now stored in a pair of cabinets that stood side by side on one wall, but this particular one needed to be displayed. It was a piece of history. He smiled slightly at an old memory. He had been fascinated by the music box's history as a child. The fall of the Nikolaevna family was the event that had led to the famous story of Anastasia, the daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, that had supposedly survived the execution of her family and lived her life in exile. It had later been proven that she hadn't actually survived the massacre, but still, it was a good story. It was also a story that his father had known, and yet the music box had still ended up for sale. The man should have known better. Michael sighed and shook his head. It didn't matter. There was no point in going down that particular road. All that mattered was that things were getting fixed now. He went back into the shop and closed the bookcase. Just as the lock clicked into place, the front door of the shop opened. For a moment he thought that the location of the hidden door might have been compromised, but he quickly reminded himself that the front door itself would have blocked the view of the bookcase. His grandfather had purposely laid the room out that way. A woman in a brown and black outfit that he instantly recognized as a sheriff's uniform stepped into the store. She appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s. Her long brown hair was tied back in a braid that laid over one shoulder. Her face and arms were freckled. She was fairly short, barely over 5 feet tall, but there was an air of authority about her. A file folder was tucked under one arm. Her brown eyes focused on him. "Mr. Dyer?" she asked. "That's me," he confirmed, moving forward to shake her hand. "You must be Sheriff Grant." She nodded. "Please, call me Maggie. Everybody does. Mayor Dilfer tells me that you can help with a problem that we're having." She asked me to help, yes. Believe me, I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes here. She smiled and shook her head. "I'm not one of those cops that gets all bristly when a specialist is brought on board, Mr. Dyer." "Michael." "Michael it is, then. Is there a place where we can talk?" "Yeah, absolutely. Right through here." He led her through a side door and into the kitchen. To the right of the refrigerator was a set of stairs that led down to a landing with the back door before descending further into the basement. Since the storefront took so much space up, the basement had been converted into a living room. A small couch and chair were set up around a table. Michael sat down on the couch and motioned for the visitor to take the much more comfortable chair. She flopped down with a sigh. "It's a hot one out there," Maggie commented, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "It is indeed," he agreed. "Can I get you something to drink?" "I wouldn't say no to water. I've been out in the field all morning trying to track down a lost cat." He opened a small mini fridge next to the couch and fished out a bottle of water. His father had put the fridge there so the beer was always at hand, but he had cleared out the cans of cheap booze and replaced them with water and soda the previous night. "I didn't realize that the sheriff's office handles loose animals," Michael said as he handed her the plastic bottle. "The luxurious life of a small-town sheriff," she replied with a lopsided smile. "Lost pets, blown tires, cars that won't start. You name it, and it probably falls under my job description. With the town expansion over the last few years, we're getting close to opening some new departments to handle things, but we're not quite there yet." He eyed the folder that she had set down on the table. "Sounds like you got something a lot more interesting than a lost cat." She took a long drink before nodding. "Yeah, I do. 3 children, all taken from their bedrooms in the middle of the night, and presumed dead." His eyes narrowed. "Presumed? The mayor said that there were multiple confirmed fatalities." "Nothing confirmed, no. I'm not sure why she would have lied to you about that. It's a good bet that there will be, though. Take a look for yourself." Michael leaned forward and picked up the unlabeled folder. He opened it and looked at the contents. He immediately regretted that decision. The folder contained a series of photographs. The one on top showed a bedroom that clearly belonged to a young boy. The walls were painted blue, and numerous posters of baseball players lined the walls. A twin bed was pushed up against one corner, and a toy chest rested against its footboard. A 3-drawer dresser sat in the opposite corner. A small desk was under the room's only window. The room was wrecked, and nearly every surface was smeared with blood. "Unpleasant, isn't it?" Maggie asked grimly. Michael nodded slowly. He ran his eyes over the picture, focusing on a small section before moving on to the next. The mattress was hanging off the side of the bed, and the covers were balled up near the door leading into the hallway. All 3 drawers had been pulled out of the dresser and tossed to the other side of the room. The toy chest was flipped over, and one of the lid hinges had been pulled completely out of the wood. The desk was still standing, but the right side had been dragged away from the wall. Blood covered everything. He had seen a lot of crime scenes, but never one where there was this much splatter. It looked less like an attack than someone splashing buckets of gore everywhere. "That's the most recent one that you're looking at," Maggie informed him. "There have been 2 others over the past 3 months. All of them like, well, that." "When did this one take place?" Michael asked. "A little under 3 weeks ago." He winced. "I'm guessing that the crime scene isn't still intact." She raised an eyebrow. "Actually, that particular one is still tarped off and left the way it was. Billy Whedon's father died a few years back in a motorcycle accident, and his mother refuses to go back into the house after, well, you can imagine how she felt after discovering this." He looked up from the picture. "I need to see it." I figured that you would. I've got the keys to the house with me. We can go over now before we run out of daylight. Michael led the way back up the stairs. As he came around the corner, he saw that Sarah was playing with Mira in the store. The creature turned its head towards him and, apparently seeing the expression on his face, quickly disappeared before Maggie could catch a glimpse of it. I need to go out for a bit, he told Sarah, hoping that his tone conveyed just how close they had come to a disaster. Try not to burn the place down while I'm gone. Geez, you set fire to one little house and you never hear the end of it, she joked with an exaggerated roll of her eyes. I'll call you on the way back. Chapter 10. Sarah watched the front door close inside in relief. Mira had barely managed to disappear before the sheriff had seen it. That had been way too close for comfort. She walked over to the front window and pulled back the curtain slightly so that she could see out. Her father and the sheriff got into the woman's car, and a moment later they were pulling out of the driveway and onto the road. She had been told that the town mayor had asked, or more accurately told, Dad to assist with some sort of criminal investigation, but he hadn't shared any other details. The look on his face as he had left had said louder than words that whatever he was assisting with wasn't pleasant. Mira reappeared on the counter and squeaked at her. You, little thing, almost blew it, Sarah told it with mock sternness. What would have happened if that lady saw you? The creature seemed to consider her question for a moment before it replied with another squeak. That's a very good counterpoint. I concede to your obviously superior debate skills. She laughed and gave Mira a quick scratch on the chin. The tips of her fingers buzzed slightly as they came into contact with the fur. It was a strange sensation, but not an unpleasant one. She glanced over at the notebook her father had been using to take inventory. There was no point in continuing in his absence. She had no way of knowing which items should stay out for sale and which should be locked away. She yawned and worked a kink out of her neck. Boredom was quickly creeping in. She went back over to the window and looked outside again. There was nothing out there, just the lawn and empty road. On a whim, she opened the door and stepped outside onto the porch. You coming, Mira? She asked. There was a static-like crackle, and Mira appeared on her shoulder. The creature barely weighed anything. She looked over at it as best she could given the awkward angle and smiled at it. I thought you might. Come on, let's go take a look at the rest of this place. Not sure where to start, she walked over to the gravel driveway and followed it towards the detached garage. It wasn't much to look at, just a small building with barely enough room for 2 cars. The paint was peeling and a number of boards looked like they were rotting. The door was down and there were no windows to look through. She knelt down and gripped the door's metal handle. When she tried to pull it up, she found that it wouldn't budge. She tried again with the same result. It was locked. That's disappointing, she mumbled, giving the handle one last tug before releasing it. The house's backyard was large. She was terrible at estimating size and distance, but it was at least a few acres. Beyond the size, though, there wasn't much to it. Just weeds and grass desperately in need of mowing. She was about to give up and go back inside when she noticed a small building at the far corner of the yard. It was hard to tell from so far away, but it looked like a shed. Well, we might as well check it out, she said to Mira. It's not like I'm in any kind of rush. The creature made a sound that she took as agreement. It took quite a while for her to reach the shed. The grass was so tall that she couldn't see the ground below it, and she was tripped up by holes or pieces of debris half a dozen times. To make sure that she didn't fall and hurt herself, she slowed down to barely more than a crawl. She sighed in relief when she finally reached her destination. The shed was even less impressive up close. It was made out of the same kind of painted wood as the garage. It was just a few inches taller than she was, with a sloped roof that somehow remained attached despite a number of broken nails sticking out of it. I think the only thing we're going to find here is tetanus, she observed. Not really expecting the door to be unlocked, Sarah reached out and pulled on the handle. To her surprise, it swung open easily. The hinges were silent as the door moved. She frowned slightly. The state of disrepair that the shed was in, why would the hinges be oiled? She glanced back at Forgotten Tales. There was no point in worrying about some oiled hinges when there was a house with impossible rooms and screaming music boxes sitting within spitting distance. She opened the door all the way and looked inside. There was nothing there. She examined the inside of the shed closely just in case she was missing something, but there was only dust and dirt. There wasn't anything of interest. Well, it had been worth a shot. She was starting to close the door when something on the ground caught her eye. There was just a hint of metal sticking out of the dirt. She would have never noticed it if she hadn't been looking at it from the exact angle that she was, and the sunlight wasn't right where it needed to be. Mira hopped off her shoulder and watched curiously as she got down on her knees to brush away the dirt. Her efforts unveiled a metal ring. She tried to lift it with 2 fingers and found that it was attached to something further under the dirt. She wrapped her hand around it and pulled up. There was a moment of resistance before a hatch opened with the hiss of escaping air. She pulled the door open as far as it would go. The hole was large enough for a person to enter, and there were stairs leading downward under the earth. It was too dark to see past the first few stairs, so she pulled out her cell phone and turned on the flashlight app. The pale glow illuminated further down, but she was still unable to see the bottom. She felt uneasy, and she glanced back at the house. Maybe it was best if she didn't let her curiosity get the better of her. Mira made the decision for her. It sniffed at the hatch door for a few seconds, its eyes narrowed and its ears flat against its back. With a low growl, it disappeared, only to reappear a few steps down into the hole. It repeated the process until it was completely out of sight. "Damn it," Sarah bit out as she quickly followed down the stairs. Chapter 11. To Michael's relief, Maggie pulled the car up against the curb and put it into park. She had driven like a bat out of hell, and he was somewhat surprised that they had made it to the crime scene in one piece. He was pretty sure that all 4 tires had come off the pavement at one point. He opened the passenger door and stumbled out of the car. He took a deep breath and allowed his nerves to calm down for a few heartbeats before he took in his surroundings. They were in one of the older residential neighborhoods in Lamplight Woods. It was next to a small park that his mother used to bring him to when he was very young, back before the cancer had taken her mere days before he had started first grade. The house in front of him had been built in the 1920s or 1930s. It was 2 stories, with a gently sloped brown shingle roof and a smaller version of it just above the front door. 4 rectangular windows looked out from each story, 2 sets of 2 on each side. Bricks lined the base. A stone path led up to 2 concrete stairs that in turn led to the door. While it was an older house, the owner had clearly been taking care of it. The paint didn't look more than a few years old, and there wasn't anything that required more than minor repairs. It was the house of someone that had worked to make it a home. "I've never worked with a consultant before," Maggie admitted as she came around the side of the car to join him. "How do you want to handle this?" "I have a process," Michael told her. "It's a way that I like to do things so that I can keep everything straight." "A man with a plan. Go on." "I don't want you to tell me anything when we get inside. If I ask a question, you can answer it, obviously, but otherwise, don't tell me anything." "So you don't want to know anything about the crime scene that you're investigating?" He smiled slightly. "Yeah, I know, it sounds counterintuitive, but it lets me come at things with fresh eyes." She returned the smile. "If I didn't know any better, I think that you're implying that the small-town yokel sheriff can't properly break down a crime scene." "Not at all. In fact, I'm counting on you being good at your job. When I'm done with my examination, we'll compare notes and see where we're at. 2 sets of eyes pick up more than 1. She nodded. "Agreed. Do you want to start with the boys' bedroom, or do you want to see the rest of the house first?" "The bedroom first. We can work our way out from there. Do you happen to have any nitrile gloves?" "I keep a box in the back seat. I'll grab it." With the small box in hand, she led him through the front door and up the flight of stairs just inside and to the left of the entryway. He followed her to one of the bedrooms, where she lifted the police tape blocking the doorway so that he could duck underneath it. He took 2 steps to the door and stopped. The bedroom was just like it looked in the picture. The furniture, clothes, and toys were in complete disarray around the room. There was even more blood than he initially believed based on the pictures he had seen. It was everywhere, a thick, dry crust that coated the majority of the space. The child hasn't been found yet, you said? Michael asked as he slowly looked around. Not yet, Maggie replied in a strained voice. He furrowed his brow. The same thing with the other two missing children, correct? Correct. He turned towards her. You said that you don't know why Mayor Dilfer told me that there were confirmed fatalities when there haven't been any yet. I get the feeling that's not entirely true. She shrugged. I mean, I don't have any proof or anything, but Her Royal Highness has been known to stretch the truth when it suits her. My guess is that she thought it would help get you onto the case. What a great mayor that you have here. Oh yeah, she's absolutely wonderful. She scratched her chin. With that said, given the state of this room and the others, I can't imagine that she's wrong about these being murders. There's no way the boy could have survived this much blood loss. Michael forced down his annoyance with the mayor and turned his attention back to the matter at hand. Maggie handed him a pair of the nitrile gloves. He pulled the tight blue material over his hands and flexed his fingers to loosen them up. This isn't right, he muttered. No, it's not, Maggie agreed. This kind of thing happening to someone, especially a defenseless kid, it's just plain awful. Not that, I mean, yes, it is definitely awful, but that's not what I mean. This entire crime scene is off. It's just the way that I found it, she said firmly. He shook his head. I'm not questioning how you handled the scene, Maggie. I'm questioning how any of this happened in the first place. He walked to the center of the bedroom and turned around slowly in a circle. He stopped when he had made a full rotation, then looked up at the ceiling and down at the ground. Having confirmed his suspicions, he nodded to himself. There's no blood splatter pattern, he said. There's no point of origin, and there's no central location where the victim would have been located as the blood went outward. There's just random splashes of blood thrown everywhere and pools of it all over the place. Which means what? Maggie asked. If I didn't know any better, I would say that this crime scene has been staged. You seem to be saying that you do know better. He frowned. It could theoretically be possible for it to be staged, but I just don't see what the point would be. There are much easier ways to cover up a murder or kidnapping, and for this to have happened at all three different houses, I just can't see it. Hold on there. She stepped into the bedroom to join him. You're saying that there's a chance these are kidnappings instead of murders? I don't know. Maybe. All this blood. There's just too much of it. This is way more than an adult's body holds, and the victims have been children. Since this can't all be the boys, the question becomes if any of it is. If it isn't, or if only a small amount of it is, that leads down the path of this being a possible kidnapping. No bodies have been recovered, she said as she chewed on her lower lip. I have to say, the possibility of those kids being alive somewhere out there is one that I really want to cling on to. There's no way of knowing for sure one way or another. Not yet, anyway. What's that? Michael had noticed an odd bulge on the wall next to the bed. He went over to it and ran one gloved finger over it. It felt soft and moist, like drywall that had recently absorbed water. He gently pressed on it and found that there was something behind it. That wasn't there when I was here last, Maggie informed him. Do you have a knife with you? He asked. Or maybe a pencil? Anything with a point. Yeah, let's see. She searched her pockets. I've got a pen. Will that work? He took the writing instrument from her and removed the cap. Placing the tip against the spot on the wall, he slowly but firmly pushed against it. The pen broke through the outer layer. He pulled it back out and looked through the hole that it had made. Not believing what he was seeing, he leaned in closer to confirm. What is it? Maggie asked, coming over to stand next to him. It's blood, Michael replied. The wall is bleeding. Chapter 12. The stairs didn't descend into the ground as deeply as Sarah had originally thought. She had only gone down 15 or 20 feet when she reached the bottom. The angle of the stairs themselves must have blocked the light when she had first peered through the hatch. She used her phone's flashlight app to take in her surroundings. The room had stone walls and a poured concrete floor. Along one wall stood 4 large metal sinks. They reminded her of the kind that restaurants used. On the opposite wall were dozens of large hooks. They were over 3 feet long, each with a curved razor-sharp tip. The light from her phone reflected off the points. She felt herself shudder. She didn't want to imagine what they were used for. She stepped off the stairs and onto the concrete. After only a few steps, she noticed that the floor gently sloped towards the center of the room. She followed the dip with her eyes and found a drain located in the middle. Mira was standing at the far end of the room and staring at the wall. As Sarah approached, she found that the spot the animal was fixated on was actually a door. It was taller than she was and made of metal. Instead of a knob, it had a locking wheel, the same kind that were normally present on ships. "Mira," Sarah called quietly. "Come on, we shouldn't be—" The creature disappeared. "In here," she finished with a sigh. She placed a hand on the wheel and paused. Mira hadn't necessarily gone behind the door. Her father had told her that it could cover at least 20 yards in any direction when it teleported. Maybe it had gone back outside. There was a tiny muffled squeak from the other side of the door. "Of course," she muttered. She tried to turn the wheel, but it only moved about an inch. She readjusted her grip and put her weight into it. This time it began to turn, setting the grating sound of metal scraping metal echoing around the chamber. There was a heavy thud, and the door opened. Holding her phone in front of her, she stepped over the bottom of the frame and went through the opening. She was standing inside of a tunnel. There was no concrete here, just wooden beams and a dirt floor. Small bulbs hung from wires running across the ceiling, but none of them gave off any light. She had once taken a tour of a coal mine on a school trip, and she was reminded of that experience as she walked. It wasn't a long passage, and she soon arrived at a second door. It was identical to the one that she had just passed through, but this time the wheel spun more easily. She pulled it open and continued on. The next room wasn't any more pleasant than the first one she had come to. The walls on the left side were lined with steel cages. The bars were thick and close together. Peering through them, she saw that there were chains with manacles attached to the bottom of each cage. The door stood open. The overhead bulbs were lit here, casting a dim yellowish light over the restraints and filling the corners of the room with shadows. "Mira," Sarah called out in a voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get the hell out of here." There was no answer. She turned off the flashlight app and put her phone in her pocket. Moving slowly past the cages, she crossed over to the far wall and came to yet another door. She turned the wheel and opened it. Being careful to make as little noise as possible, she passed through it. She was in a narrow corridor, only about 6 feet wide. The walls were constructed entirely of metal, with large bolts attaching them from floor to ceiling. She reached out and touched the wall to her left. It was cool to the touch, and she could feel a soft vibration running through it. Standing at the end of the hallway was Mira. The animal was staring at the left wall intently. The fur on its back was raised, and the soft glow that always radiated from it was brighter than it normally was. Its teeth were bared. Something was very wrong. Sarah moved towards it slowly. On her left were doors made of the same metal as the hallway. Each door had a small panel with a latch. It looked like they could be slid to one side so that someone could look through and into the room beyond. She wasn't sure if it was because of a morbid curiosity or some survival instinct telling her that she needed to know what she was dealing with, but she went over to the first door. She gripped the latch and slid the panel to the side. Steeling herself, she looked through the hole. The room inside was dark, with no overhead lights like were present in the hallway. She thought about using her phone to attempt to see better, but she quickly dismissed the idea. If there was something concealed in the shadows, it might not be happy with the change in illumination. The room's floor was moving. It wasn't until she heard a faint dripping noise that she worked out what she was seeing. She was looking at a pool of water. The liquid began to glow. It was a bright green light that expanded and contracted like a beating heart. Thanks to the light being produced, she could see that there wasn't anything else present in the room. A tiny ball of light separated itself from the mass and rose out of the water. It hovered above the surface, drifting lazily from side to side. Another ball emerged and joined it, and then another. In less than a minute, the entire room was filled with the small spheres. It was beautiful. One of the lights moved towards her. She held one finger through the hole in the door. The ball landed on it. It felt warm and it had no weight to it. She smiled. When she was little, she had been obsessed with fairies. It had gotten to the point where she had insisted on wearing her Tinkerbell costume to bed. She wondered if this was the real-world equivalent of a fairy. Her awe turned to pain as something hot and sharp jabbed into her finger. She swore and firmly shook the ball of light off her skin. There was a welt where it had been resting. It had burned her. The other balls of light were starting to come closer to the door. Pulling her hand back, she quickly slammed the panel closed and put the latch back into place. She took a moment to center herself before moving on to the next door. She really didn't want to check another room after what had just happened, but the thought of having something behind her that she wasn't aware of was far worse. She opened the panel and peered inside. There was a light inside of this room, a single bulb that was suspended from the ceiling on a wire. Sitting directly underneath it, on a rickety wooden chair, was an incredibly thin man. Although his back was turned to her, she could still see just how emaciated he was. His long black hair was greasy, and it clung to his naked back. His head was slumped down against his chest. She could hear him whispering, either to her or to himself. Something about the man set off warning sirens in Sarah's head. She quickly shut the panel and backed away from the door. Her instincts were screaming for her to get as far away as possible. The third room was filled to the brim with caskets. Each of the coffins was wrapped in heavy chains, and many of them had been bolted to the floor with thick iron bandings. It was a very strange scene, one which she couldn't begin to explain, but she had no intention of investigating further. She closed the panel and continued on until she came to Mira, reaching the final door in the process. Chapter 13. "I'm hoping that you've seen this sort of thing before," Maggie said as they watched the blood run down out of the hole in the wall and onto the floor. "I've never seen anything remotely like it," Michael replied. "Great. I just assumed that you Dyers had run into pretty much everything at one point or another." "Nothing like this. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio." "I'm no English major, but I'm pretty sure that Shakespeare didn't have this in mind when he was writing Hamlet." He snorted. "Probably not." He put the pen back into the hole it had punctured and gently pushed it in deeper. The hole widened slightly, and the blood began to flow out at a faster rate. The tip of the pen hit resistance less than 2 inches in. At first he assumed that he had hit insulation. The more he moved the pen around, though, the less he thought that was the case. This was firmer, more solid than soaked insulation should be. "I need to see what's going on back there," he said, extracting the pen. "I've got a toolbox in the trunk," Maggie told him. "I'll be right back." Michael began to look around the rest of the room while he waited. It had been a long time since he had stood in the middle of a paranormal event. He had been hoping that there would be some logical and natural explanation for the pictures he had been shown. He had doubted it, but he had hoped for that all the same. He picked up a stuffed bear from the floor. It was wearing a shirt with the Cincinnati Reds logo. The left half of it was coated in thick blood. The other half was in remarkably good shape. His entire childhood had been about preparing him for the unnatural world his family dabbled in. At first, the education had seemed like a game. His grandfather had been a kind teacher, and he had put an emphasis on the wonders of the unknown universe while still making sure that his grandson understood the dangerous side of Lamplight Woods. When Grandpa Charles had passed away, Michael's father Gerald had taken over his teaching. Something had been broken in the man years earlier, and that something had turned him petty and cruel. He took much of that out on his son. An old and unwelcome memory came back to Michael. He closed his eyes. Even though it had been decades since it happened, he could still smell the odd mixture of tobacco and burning flesh as his father pressed the half-smoked cigar into the back of his right shoulder. He could no longer remember the pain it caused, but he doubted that he'd ever forget the wretched smell. His grandfather had made him feel a sense of responsibility and pride for their family's service to Lamplight Woods. They helped to keep people safe and secure, and there was no higher calling than that. His father had replaced those feelings with much worse ones that had led him to abandoning the family business altogether. He opened his eyes. His father had died from a sudden heart attack. There had been no warning. It had come out of nowhere. That meant that Gerald Dyer had still been in charge of watching over Lamplight Woods' paranormal occurrences when these children had been taken. The man had accepted the monthly payment the town had given him for his services, and he enjoyed the tax-free status that Forgotten Tales was given as part of the compensation. In return, he had failed in his duty. Michael had decided to find a new caretaker for both the town and Forgotten Tales. He and Sarah's lives were back in San Diego, and there were too many bad memories here. He would have to talk with the mayor and probably Maggie about who would be the best suited to take things over when they left. Before he could do that, though, he needed to see this case through. He had to do what his father either couldn't or wouldn't do, give the family of these children answers. Even if those answers ended up being what they feared most, they still deserved them. "Here we go," Maggie said as she returned to the room, a toolbox gripped in one hand. "What's your weapon of choice?" "A hammer should do it," Michael answered, pulling himself out of his thoughts. He took the tool she handed him and went back over to the section of the wall he had been prodding. The bleeding still hadn't stopped. In fact, it seemed to be coming out even faster. "You'll probably want to step back," he warned the sheriff. "There might be a splash zone." Turning the hammer around, he struck the wall with the claws. They dug into the drywall as blood splattered outward from the blow. He adjusted his grip and pulled hard. A piece of the wall broke away and fell to the floor. He had the unpleasant mental image of a scab being stripped from a wound. Blood drained freely out of the wall now, and it sloshed over his shoes before he could get out of the way. He gritted his teeth and went back to work with the hammer. The drywall was soft and decayed from constant exposure to moisture. It only took him a few minutes to clear away a large section. "There's definitely something back here," he said as he resisted the urge to wipe the sweat off his forehead with his blood-covered gloves. "What is it?" Maggie asked from the doorway. "I don't know yet. It's hard to see through all of this. Can you see if there's a bucket or a pitcher or something that could be filled with water so we can rinse this off?" As she left to find what he had asked for, he went over to the opposite wall and broke a hole in it with the hammer. He cleared enough of the drywall away to see that the same thing was happening on this side of the room as well. He watched the blood running out of the new opening while he racked his brain for any sort of paranormal activity that he had heard of that was even remotely similar to this. Nothing came to mind. Bleeding walls were a rare part of some hauntings, sure, but this was different. He turned his eyes up towards the ceiling. He had a suspicion, and there was only one way to find out if it was correct. Being careful not to slip in the fresh ichor coating the floor, he dragged the small desk chair over to the center of the room. He stood on it and reached up to touch the ceiling. It wasn't a very tall chair, but luckily it wasn't a very high ceiling either. Bracing himself as best he could, he struck the plaster with the hammer. He wasn't expecting such a large piece to come free. He barely ducked out of the way in time as the 2-foot-wide section ripped away and tumbled down to the floor. Blood streamed out like a waterfall. Maggie came in with a bucket filled with water. Michael got down off the chair, took the bucket from her, and went back to the original opening that he had made. Wiping away the blood as best he could with his hands, he raised the bucket up and slowly poured its contents into the gap. It didn't clear out as much as he had hoped, but it was enough to get a better look at what was underneath it. "What the fuck?" he exclaimed loudly. "What?" Maggie asked, hurrying over to him. "What is it?" "It's tissue." He pointed through the hole at the pink mass on the other side of the drywall. "The entire space between this wall and the one behind it is filled with muscle and tissue." Chapter 14. Sarah stood motionless next to Mira for a long moment. There was an odd sound coming from the animal, a constant low hum in the back of its throat. It sounded both angry and afraid. What's wrong? She asked, immediately realizing just how silly it was to ask that question in this particular place. Mira either didn't hear her or didn't bother to respond. It just kept growling at the door, its lips pulled back to expose its sharp teeth. She had just viewed the frightening contents of 3 chambers, but somehow seeing the normally playful creature displaying such raw hatred and fear made her even more afraid. She turned to the door. It looked the same as the others. Given what she had already seen, there was most likely something terrible being kept behind it. Mira had ignored the other doors and went straight to this one. She had the sinking feeling that meant whatever was beyond it was the worst of all. She raised her hand towards the sliding panel, but just as she was about to touch it, she froze. She glanced back down at Mira. Had the animal sensed a danger and gone to investigate, or had it led her here on purpose? Taking a deep breath, she slid the panel open and leaned forward to look inside. The room was dim. There were 4 exposed light bulbs hanging from the ceiling, 1 in each corner. Every square inch of the walls and ceiling were covered in the same metal as the hallway they were standing in. In the center of the room was a chair. Unlike the one that she had seen in the chamber with the emaciated man, this one was made of metal. Seated on it, with thick chains wrapped around it, was what appeared to be a hand puppet. It was sitting perfectly still in the middle of the chair. Designed to look like a Siberian husky, its fur was gray and black with white accents. It was adorned in a black top hat and a red suit coat with tails. Its head was tilted slightly to the right. Its clothes were covered in brown stains. There were similar markings around his mouth as well. She couldn't be sure, but it looked a lot like blood that had dried long ago. As she watched, the puppet lifted its head and looked back at her. Mira's growling grew louder. Faint music began to fill Sarah's ears. It was the sound of a calliope playing, its pleasant song bringing with it images of carnivals and the circus. The smell of popcorn wafted into her nose, and she could taste cotton candy on the end of her tongue. She smiled to herself. She was once again 8 years old, holding her father's hand as they attended a street festival. This wasn't some memory. She was once again there, and she felt happier than she had been in a long time. In the middle of everything was the puppet. He watched her from a distance with his blue eyes. She raised her hand and waved at it, and it did the same with its left paw. Pulling on her father's hand, she led them closer to the puppet. Her mind snapped back into focus as she felt an intense pain in her ankle. She gasped and tore her eyes free from the figure to look down. Mira had sunk its teeth into her leg and was biting down. It wasn't hard enough to break the skin, but it still hurt like crazy. "Mira," Sarah snapped. "What the hell are you doing?" The animal released its grip and looked up at her with a somber expression on its face. It squeaked once and turned its nose towards the door. Her anger quickly dissipated as she understood what it was trying to tell her. Mira hadn't randomly decided to chew on her. It had done so to break her out of her stupor. Without looking back into the room, she reached up and slid the panel shut. She didn't know what had just happened, but something had. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said in a much friendlier tone. As she turned to go back out the way they had come, she heard the rattling of chains from behind the door. She stopped moving and listened intently, her heart hammering in her chest. The jingling of metal stopped as quickly as it had begun. She slowly backed away further. She could now hear breathing on the other side of the door. It was low and ragged, but it was unmistakably breathing. Despite having clearly been chained to both the chair and the floor in the center of the room, the puppet was now just a few feet away from her. The only thing separating them was the door. "Tell Mikey," a decidedly male voice said, "that I really enjoyed my personal time with Evie, and I can't wait to have some with you." Sarah turned and ran. The puppet's laughter echoed off the walls as she hurried back to the underground facility. She only paused long enough to shut and lock each of the heavy doors as she passed through them. Reaching the first room with the sinks and hooks, She nearly slipped on the smooth concrete floor. She caught herself at the last second and bolted up the stairs. Mira appeared inside the shed right before she slammed the hatch shut, and together they crossed the yard. When they were about halfway back to Forgotten Tales, she began to calm down and slowed her pace. It had been mid-afternoon when she had first gone down through the hatch. Now the sun was much lower in the sky, and the first shadows of evening had appeared. Panting and trying to catch her breath, she took out her phone and checked the time. She blinked, not fully comprehending the numbers it presented her. She was sure that she had only been underground for 15 or 20 minutes at most, but the clock was saying that it had been over 2 hours. She turned back towards the closed shed door. It couldn't have been that long. She raised her face towards the sky and once again noted the sun's position. Could it? She thought back to the thing's deep blue eyes and shuddered despite the summer heat.